in a game that uses traditional audio diaries, the shape of the space is still a shape of the story, because you go into a room and you find certain audio diaries, then you go into the next room and you find them, and so that is defining the progression of the story as you discover it. But in these AR scenes, they're multi-path, like different characters are moving all over the space in kind of a non-linear way.
And things are happening simultaneously.
Right, there's all this overlap where, two characters might be, in the gym together speaking, but one of them is talking on an AR call and the other one is in the locker room, and they're having two totally separate conversations, but then that have to take the same amount of time, so that when their paths connect, they can then speak to each other and then split off again. And all of that stuff required us to, write to the space. Right. So the process was that, like, Nina and Tynan blocked out these spaces and put down where all the rooms were and what spaces we had to work with first before we wrote a single word. And then we had to say, okay, you've got the locker room, the gym, cargo, and so then who is where and what are they saying and how long is it going to take Evie to walk from cargo to Clive's office, and what's he doing before she gets there, because there is no... It doesn't matter what she's doing before he gets there, because the player will never know. It's like the player can be there. Yeah. We have to fill in all of those spaces.
Right. He can't just sit there and wait for, like, the action to start happening. He has to do something. And so, and of course, when we tried to write all of this stuff out with, like, these parallel paths, we were totally unable to make everything match up until we physically acted out everything.
Yeah.
And did all the lines ourselves.
Yeah. It was a huge kind of experimental process, I guess, of first discovering how you write it, where you're like, okay, so you have to write each of the sections kind of as its own little scene and then make sure that they all link up. And then to test that, something that was great for us was that we actually had a similar sized development team to the size of the crew in the game. And so, we had to go from words on the page to actually doing basically like dry run rehearsals of it as a group, because you can't really know if the timing of everything lines up until you hear it acted out and you see how the characters moving in the scene are going to affect the timing of everything. Something that was really interesting to think about when designing these scenes was there are points in these scenes where there are no characters in certain rooms. So, for instance, here in the locker room, Sarah starts here, and then she has part of her scene here and she leaves. And presumably most players will follow her and see where she goes and see how she encounters Andrew. But you might think, well, wait a second, if I was to go into the locker room and wait for Sarah to leave, you're thinking about what might be there. So in each of the main AR scenes, there's one of these AR speakers, and while the characters are there in that space engaged in part of the story, there's music playing in the background from these speakers that kind of accompanies what they're doing. But after they've left, if you hang out with the speaker, you'll hear one of these speeches from Sergio Venturi, the CEO of the Venturis Corporation in the game. And it's something that I hope that players who either intentionally seek these out or just stumble upon one will have that spark of surprise at this extra thing being there and go back and see where else they can find more and really fill out the rest of the story's universe with these little hidden pieces that are kind of, under the surface of what's going on in the AR scenes. Right in this area, there are multiple instances of, if this was just video recording, there would be, complete nudity going on with Nat and Sarah in these situations. And so on the one hand, you're not directly confronted with that, but on the other hand, that means that the fact that you're kind of like being invasive in these private moments takes maybe a little bit longer to sink in. Right.
Once you figure that out, though, you're like, oh, what is this company doing?
Yeah.
And that is,
I find it interesting to give the player access to a lot of different elements of these characters' experience, including very private stuff that no one else is supposed to know, or that, only they think of themselves as having access to. And the AR figures give us the ability to put the player in the room in these situations in hopefully a way that kind of walks that line of being kind of uncomfortable when you think about it, but also not being so
prurient.
Yeah, exactly. As it would have been if you were just standing there at the time.
It's less working blue, but hopefully still emotionally resonant.
From a level design perspective, why was the actual station built with so many angles in the first place?
Basically to make an interesting shape and sightline. That was like my intention. When I was doing the original grade blocks, everything was pretty squished together because, we were really emphasizing like keeping the station feeling compact and, small enough to be realistic in space,
Yeah. And then the wall models themselves are like, because they're angled on top of angles, so it means that the footprint of at the base, so the floor area is actually smaller than the ceiling at the top. So sometimes I would put the final meshes in, and the top part of the wall would cut into like Cleve's closet. And in the whole design and environment art, there's this idea of the grid being God.
Yeah.
And that whole area, like, we just totally ignored the grid, and we just, everything is just sort of bespokely created.
Yeah. It's funny because, like, I think the area is still, like, it's cool to walk through, and Ops is one of the wings that I think we pulled off the, like, feeling compact on a space station theme the best. Because it really does feel like you're kind of in this constrained space. I mean, the gym is pretty open, but like this hallway with Cleve's bunk and office, I do feel like it feels small and realistic. So despite the challenges of actually building it, I still feel like it's successful.
Lessons were learned.
Yeah.
So you were looking at what is now the lobby of the Zenith Lunar Resort on the surface of the moon, but that is not what the area depicted was originally made for.
Yeah, this was originally the main lobby of the station where the visitors would come in and this would be the first thing they'd see.
In the original version of the game, Tacoma Station was a much more opulent. It was a customer-facing space, and still in our fiction, the richest of the rich are the people who do things like come up to the lunar resort. But partway through development, we realized that these big, opulent public spaces are kind of the antithesis of what our games are about, which is kind of getting into these dense, intimate spaces that tell you a lot about the people who lived in them.
Right, certainly, like, almost by definition, like, a big public space, no matter how fancy and detailed, cannot be personal.
Yeah, I mean, it can tell you about the state of the world broadly, it can tell you about the function of the place, but you would have to go into the offices of the people who run the place and look at their workspaces and see their personal effects to really understand who they were. And so a big part of revisiting the core, like, kind of conceit of the game was to say, how do we make the station as a whole something that can tell you about who the people that live and work here every day really are?
So there's a lot of QR codes in the game on various packages and communications and other things like that. And basically, I think we just chose them as a method for information storage just because they're so annoying. Like, nobody likes QR codes. It's totally the kind of choice that a big company like Venturis or any other of the big companies in the game would choose. And we also really liked the idea that the player could actually scan them and get additional information. Usually that's just like, ingredients or something, but occasionally there's some cute stuff in there. One of Cleve's themes is kind of past glory or, glory days kind of thinking, because having jumped ship from his first job, he now looks back on that being like, those were the good old days, and he looks back on his time in college similarly, and he has a lot of fiction that is, from the 60s in London. He has picked photos from old-timey
Londonton,
and as no one calls it.
Yeah, I think he has a lot of nostalgia, and I think he has a lot of reminders of hopes. Well, and I think it's, it's a way of depicting that he does want more for himself.
Yeah.
And so, something about Tacoma in general, I think, is that it's about a lot of people who are trapped in a situation, and it's a lot of different situations. It's about people's obligations and the friction between what they want and where they are and where they can actually get to from there. And being posted on Tacoma is not a great gig.
Right.
It's not glamorous. And I think Clive's version of that is spending a lot of time thinking back to when he had all the potential from his college football days and to the romantic glory days of old-time London that he didn't actually get to live through. But it's like his idealistic picture of like where he would like to be. And so a lot of his bunk, I think, is a projection of that part of himself.
Yeah.
Poor Clve. Stupid Clve. Bye.
Operations and admin structurally mirror each other a lot, as far as like the types of rooms that were needed for this character's job. So it actually is kind of cute because there are a couple in the game too. So operations feels much more constrained, even though the gym is pretty big, but outside of the gym, things are pretty packed together.
But there was also a huge win for us, which is that when you start to make spaces where people live in them, there's a density of decoration and artifacts that you put around to kind of show that people were there and what they were doing and how it happened. And turns out making that in a really, really big room is hard for us, and in some ways hard for a player too, because you're presented with this big warehouse full of places to go and boxes to open. You can feel like you look in one corner and there's nothing there, then you might just say there's nothing anywhere, and you might get this feeling of numbness, of just finding too many of the same thing.
I kind of like Clive's bunk as an example of that, because the bunks are pretty small in general, because of this sort of more constrained rule that we gave ourselves. Because you walk in and you're basically presented with a lot of his character right away. Like, you see the little table with all the booze on it, and you see his ties are right there. Like, you've sort of got this little Clve diorama. And that's definitely an advantage you get from making more constrained spaces.